The law offices of Merrill and Whitman occupied the entire 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Boston, the kind of place that reeked of old money and whispered discretion. Rain streaked down the floor to ceiling windows, blurring the city skyline into watercolor smudges of gray and silver. I straightened my off-the-rack blazer, feeling distinctly out of place among the mahogany furnishings and oil paintings of stern-faced men who had probably never worried about student loan payments or past-due rent notices. "Mr. Chapman will see you now," announced the receptionist, her smile professionally calibrated to reveal nothing. I followed her down a hushed corridor to a conference room where my father already sat at one end of a polished table long enough to seat 20. He wore the same charcoal suit he'd worn to my mother's funeral 6 years earlier, his silver hair impeccably combed, his posture military straight despite his 73 years. He did not rise when I entered, merely nodded in acknowledgement. "Michael," he said, my name sounding formal on his lips, as if addressing a distant acquaintance rather than his only son. "Dad," I replied, taking a seat across from him rather than beside him. The silence that followed felt practiced, the latest iteration of a distance that had grown between us since my decision to pursue journalism, instead of law or business career paths he'd deemed acceptable for a Harrison man. The quarterly dinners and obligatory holiday gatherings had never bridged that gap, merely papered over it with polite conversation about weather and sports teams we both pretended to follow. Mr. Chapman, a man whose precisely trimmed beard matched his precisely pressed suit, entered with a leather portfolio under his arm. "Thank you both for coming," he said, settling at the head of the table. "As you know, we're here to discuss the last will and testament of Caroline Harrison." My grandmother's name hung in the air between my father and me. I had been her only grandchild, the unexpected point of connection in our fractured family after my mother's death. While my father retreated into work in silence, grandmother had stepped in with Sunday dinners and summer visits, her Victorian brownstone becoming more of a home to me than the sterile apartment my father and I nominally shared. "Before we begin," Mr. Chapman continued, "I should note that Mrs. Harrison was very specific about how these proceedings should unfold." He opened the portfolio, removed his reading glasses from a leather case, and glanced between us. She requested that I read the document in its entirety without interruption, regardless of any reactions its contents might prompt. My father shifted almost imperceptibly, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked windows. He would not meet my eyes, and in that moment, I knew whatever was coming would change everything. Mr. Chapman began reading with the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered legal pronouncements for decades. The initial portions followed standard formalities: revocation of previous wills, appointment of executors, confirmation of sound mind. I half listened, distracted by my father's unusual behavior. Richard Harrison had built his reputation in corporate finance on unflinching eye contact and commanding presence. Now he studied his manicured fingernails with fierce concentration, as if deciphering some hidden code within his cuticles. "Regarding the disposition of my assets," Mr. Chapman continued, his voice shifting subtly to indicate we had reached the substantive portion of the will, "I have made the following determinations after considerable reflection." My father's shoulders tensed slightly. "To my son, Richard James Harrison, I bequeath the sum of $100,000 and my collection of first-edition American literature, which he admired in his youth before practical considerations overshadowed his appreciation for narrative. A modest bequest considering my grandmother's substantial wealth." My father's expression remained carefully neutral, though a muscle twitched almost imperceptibly along his jawline. "The remainder of my estate, including but not limited to my residential property at 427 Marlborough Street, all financial investments and accounts, my art collection, and all other personal property not specifically designated elsewhere in this document, I leave to my grandson, Michael Thomas Harrison." The attorney's words seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the room. I blinked, certain I had misheard. My grandmother had been comfortable, certainly, but the brownstone alone was worth millions in Boston's relentless real estate market. Add investment portfolios and art collections, and the inheritance represented a transformation of my financial reality I could scarcely comprehend. Mr. Chapman continued reading without pause, detailing trust arrangements, tax considerations, and various smaller bequests to longtime staff and charitable organizations. Throughout, my father maintained his studied examination of his hands, his breathing measured and controlled. Finally, the attorney said, his tone shifting again to indicate we had reached some significant point, "I wish to explain the reasoning behind these decisions, though I am under no legal obligation to do so." Here, my father's discipline finally wavered, his gaze lifting briefly before dropping again, studiously avoiding any contact with mine. Throughout my life, I have valued authenticity above pretense, substance above appearance, and courage above conformity. While financial success has provided me with comfort and security, I have observed its capacity to distort priorities and relationships when treated as the primary measure of a life's worth. Mr. Chapman adjusted his glasses before continuing. My son Richard has achieved every conventional marker of success: professional standing, financial security, social position. These achievements came at costs he accepted willingly: emotional distance, personal compromise, and gradual surrender of the curiosity and compassion that once defined him as a young man. I do not judge these choices, having enabled many of them through my own emphasis on achievement and family reputation. The attorney paused briefly, allowing the words to settle in the room's heavy silence. In Michael, I recognize the qualities that wealth and status too often diminish: intellectual honesty, moral courage, and genuine empathy for others. His choice to pursue work that serves truth rather than merely power, despite the financial insecurity and family disapproval this path entailed, demonstrates values I have come to believe matter more than achievements that can be quantified in dollars or titles. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, a complex emotion somewhere between vindication and grief. All those Sunday dinners in her brownstone discussing articles I'd written about community displacement or environmental justice while my father declined her invitations in favor of networking events had been more than just grandmotherly indulgence. She had been evaluating, comparing, deciding. My hope, the will, continued, is that this inheritance will provide Michael the freedom to continue pursuing work of meaning and substance, without the financial pressures that so often corrupt such endeavors. As for Richard, I believe the symbolic nature of his bequest may prove more valuable than additional wealth, should he choose to reflect on its meaning. Mr. Chapman looked up from the document. The will concludes with standard legal language regarding execute, responsibilities, and contest provisions. He closed the portfolio deliberately. Before addressing any questions, I am instructed to deliver this. From his briefcase, he withdrew an envelope, cream-colored and sealed with dark blue wax, impressed with my grandmother's distinctive monogram. He stood, walked deliberately around the table, and extended the envelope, not to my father, but directly to me. For Michael, he said, to be read privately, after these proceedings conclude. The attorney's finger pointed straight at me, unwavering and precise. In that moment, my father finally raised his gaze, not to meet my eyes, but to stare at the envelope as if it contained something radioactive. Whatever was written inside represented more than just my grandmother's final words to me. It held some truth my father clearly feared would now come to light. The rain had intensified by the time we left the attorney's office, sheets of water cascading down the glass tower and pooling on the sidewalks below. My father and I stood awkwardly beneath the building's overhang, newly established as financial opposites by the document we'd just heard. The envelope from my grandmother felt heavy in my jacket pocket, its contents still unknown but already reshaping the air between us. There's a car waiting, my father said, gesturing toward a black town car idling at the curb, windshield wipers working furiously against the downpour. I can drop you somewhere. I'll walk, I replied automatically, though I had no umbrella and my apartment was 30 minutes away by foot. He nodded, unsurprised by my refusal. Our relationship had been defined by such small rejections for years: declined dinner invitation, abbreviated holiday visits, perfunctory birthday calls. The will had merely made explicit the emotional distance that had long existed between us. Your grandmother was ... quotes he began, then stopped, seemingly uncertain how to complete the thought. Proud? Manipulative? Right? Wrong? Whatever adjective he sought remained unspoken. She was honest, I offered finally, sometimes brutally so. Yes, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder. That she was. A moment passed between us, filled with the white noise of rain and traffic. There were questions I could have asked about his relationship with his mother, about his feelings regarding the inheritance, about the contents of the envelope that had caused him to avoid my eyes throughout the reading. Instead, I maintained the carefully constructed distance we both relied upon. I should go, I said. I have a deadline this evening. He nodded again, our conversation concluding with the same polite detachment that characterized all our interactions. As he walked toward the waiting car, shoulders squared against more than just the weather, I realized he had asked nothing about my plans for the inheritance, no questions about the brownstone. The investments, the sudden shift in my financial reality. Perhaps he already knew what the will would contain. Or perhaps he simply couldn't bring himself to acknowledge how thoroughly his mother had upended the power dynamic between us. I waited until his car pulled away before stepping into the rain, welcoming the shock of cold water against my face. The financial implications of what had just occurred would take days to fully comprehend, but the emotional aftermath demanded immediate attention. Whatever my grandmother had written in her final communication to me clearly contained something my father feared: a revelation, a judgment, a truth he had spent years avoiding. 20 minutes later, soaked to the skin but somehow clearer in mind, I arrived at Thinking Cup, a coffee shop far enough from my usual haunts that I was unlikely to encounter friends or colleagues. I ordered an Americano and claimed a corner table, finally withdrawing the envelope from my jacket pocket. The blue wax seal bore my grandmother's monograms, E.H. for Caroline, Elizabeth Harrison pressed with the signet ring she had worn daily for as long as I could remember. I broke the seal carefully and removed several pages of heavy stationery covered in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. Elegant, but practical, much like the woman herself. The letter began without preamble. Asterisk Michael. Asterisk, asterisk. By now you've heard the provisions of my will, and perhaps begun to process the significant changes they will bring to your life. Before addressing practical matters, I owe you an explanation more personal than legal documents permit. Asterisk, asterisk, what I'm about to share has been kept from you your entire life, not maliciously, but from a misguided sense of family loyalty and reputation management that has governed Harrison decisions for generations. Your father opposed my revealing this even after my death, which explains his discomfort during the reading you've just attended. Asterisk, asterisk, the truth is that Richard is not your biological father. Asterisk, I stared at the words, certain I had misread them. The coffee shop continued its ambient hum of conversations and espresso machines while my personal reality tilted on its axis. I read the sentence again, then again, its meaning unchanged by repetition. Asterisk, your mother, Elizabeth, came to me in confidence shortly before your birth. She and Richard had been experiencing marital difficulties. His work obsession and emotional distance were issues even then. During a brief separation, she had a relationship with someone else, a journalist she met while volunteering at a community advocacy organization. Asterisk, asterisk, when she discovered her pregnancy, she reconciled with Richard, who assumed the child was his. Only your mother and I knew otherwise. When complications arose during your delivery, and it became clear Elizabeth might not survive, she extracted a promise from me to protect you, to ensure you were not punished for her choices, but also to make sure you eventually knew the truth of your origin. Asterisk, asterisk, I failed in the latter part of that promise during my lifetime. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but in truth, I feared the family disruption such a revelation would cause. It was cowardice disguised as prudence, a specialty of the Harrison family. Asterisk, the coffee before me grew cold, forgotten as I absorbed revelations that retroactively rewrote my entire life history. Memories reconfigured themselves with new significance. My father's persistent emotional distance suddenly cast not as personality, but as unconscious recognition of biological reality. My natural inclination toward writing and social justice now potentially inherited rather than rebellious. Asterisk, your biological father's name is Thomas Riley. He was an investigative journalist with a focus on environmental justice and corporate accountability area. I've noted with interest that you've pursued in your own career, suggesting some traits may indeed be passed through blood rather than merely nurture. Asterisk, asterisk, after Elizabeth's death, I took it upon myself to quietly track Thomas's life and career, though I never contacted him directly. He never married, continued his award-winning journalism until health issues forced early retirement, and now lives modestly in Portland, Maine. I've included his current contact information, should you choose to reach out. Asterisk, asterisk, the inheritance I've left you comes with no obligations regarding this information. You may choose to maintain the status quo with Richard, pursue a relationship with Thomas, or forge some new path altogether. My only request is that you consider carefully before acting, as some choices once made cannot be undone. Asterisk, the letter continued with practical details about the brownstone, investment accounts, and art collection, but my mind remained fixed on the revelation at its center. I was not, biologically, a Harrison, a fact that simultaneously explained so much about my relationship with my father, while complicating my understanding of my grandmother's generosity. Was the inheritance guilt money for her decades of silence? A final act of rebellion against her son? Or simply, as she claimed, a recognition of values she had come to prioritize? As I refolded the letter, tucking it carefully back into its envelope, I realized I was now faced with decisions that would define the next chapter of my life. Decisions about identity, family, and truth that money, however substantial, could neither simplify nor resolve. The brownstone on Marlborough Street stood exactly as I remembered from countless Sunday dinners and summer visits. 4 stories of red brick and intricate stonework, bay windows overlooking the tree-lined street, black shutters framing leaded glass that had witnessed over a century of Boston history. Except now it was mine, a concept that still felt more theoretical than actual, despite the keys in my hand and the deed in my name. 2 weeks had passed since the will reading. 2 weeks of meetings with financial advisors who explained the extent of my inheritance substantially more than I had initially grasped. Of journalists from local business publications seeking comments on the Harrison fortune changing hands. Of increasingly tense text exchanges with my father, who had retreated to his Beacon Hill townhouse in strategic silence. I had taken a leave of absence from the environmental news site where I worked, explaining to my editor that family matters required my attention. The truth that I suddenly possessed the financial independence to never work again if I chose remained unspoken. My small apartment in Somerville stood half-packed, my few possessions looking increasingly insignificant against the backdrop of what I had inherited. Mrs. F. Sullivan, my grandmother's housekeeper of 30 years, met me at the door with the same brisk efficiency that had governed the household for as long as I could remember. The lawyers had finished their inventory, she informed me, taking my coat with practiced ease. Though your grandmother's personal papers remain in the study as she left them. She was quite clear those weren't to be touched by anyone but you. The house smelled of lemon polish and the subtle floral fragrance my grandmother had preferred, as if she might still descend the curved staircase at any moment, immaculately dressed and sharp-eyed despite her advanced years. I followed Mrs. Sullivan through the formal parlor toward the study at the back of the house, a room that had always been my favorite retreat during family gathering. "Will you be staying here, Mr. Michael?" Mrs. Sullivan asked, her use of my childhood designation somehow comforting amid so much change. "I've prepared the blue bedroom just in case." "Thank you. I might, just for tonight. I'm still sorting things out." She nodded, understanding more than she voiced. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything. Your grandmother left instructions about running the household that you might want to review when you're ready." Alone in the study, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the subtle scent of leather bindings, I felt my grandmother's presence most acutely. This had been her sanctuary, where she had managed both her substantial investments and her extensive correspondence with cultural and charitable organizations. The mahogany desk by the window still held her silver letter opener and crystal paperweight, positioned exactly as she had left them. The computer was new, a sleek laptop that looked out of place among the antique furnishings. A yellow post-it note on its cover read simply, "For Michael, password is Elizabeth 1987 in my grandmother's handwriting, my mother's name and the year of her death." I opened the laptop, entered the password, and found a desktop containing a single folder labeled Family Matters. Inside were meticulously organized subfolders: Richard, Financial History; Elizabeth, Correspondence; Michael, Documentation; and Thomas Riley, Research. The last folder made my breath catch. I clicked it open to find decades of compiled information, news articles about Thomas Riley's journalism career, including several major investigative pieces on corporate environmental violation, photographs clearly taken from public sources showing a man with features I recognized with a shock of familiarity, and more recently, medical records that appeared to have been obtained through means I decided not to contemplate too deeply. My biological father had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease 5 years earlier, explaining his retirement from active journalism. He lived alone in a small apartment in Portland, volunteered with a local literacy program, and maintained a modest blog about environmental issues affecting Maine's coastline. The most recent document in the folder was dated just 2 months before my grandmother's death. Private investigators' report confirming Thomas Riley's current address, routine activities, and the assessment that he maintains independence despite progressive symptoms and appears to have no knowledge of connection to Harrison family. As I processed this comprehensive dossier my grandmother had maintained on the man whose existence I had learned of only 2 weeks earlier, a new email notification appeared on the screen. The sender's name made my heart stutter: Richard Harrison. with the subject line, "We need to talk." I hesitated before opening it, mentally bracing for recriminations or legal threats. Instead, I found only a brief message: "I'm ready to discuss the truth, if you are. Dinner at my place, 7 p.m. tomorrow?" Some things shouldn't be put in writing. After 32 years of emotional distance, my father, or the man I had always known as my father, was finally offering conversation without deflection. The question was whether such a conversation could possibly bridge the chasm that had just expanded exponentially between us. My father's Beacon Hill townhouse had always struck me as a perfect reflection of the man himself, elegant but austere, historically significant but modernized for efficiency, impressive to visitors but rarely feeling like an actual home. As I rang the doorbell at precisely 7 p.m., I realized I could count on one hand the number of times I'd been invited here in the past decade. He answered the door himself rather than using the intercom, a departure from routine that suggested tonight was indeed different. "Michael, come in." He wore casual attire by his standards, a collared shirt without tie or jacket, another small signal of deviation from our usual formality. The dining room table was set for two, with what appeared to be takeout containers from an upscale Italian restaurant discreetly transferred to proper serving dishes. A bottle of wine stood open, already poured into crystal glasses that caught the light from the modern chandelier overhead. "I remembered you prefer red," he said, gesturing toward the wine as we took our seats, an unexpected acknowledgement of personal preference that momentarily disarmed me. We observed the social ritual of serving food and exchanging perfunctory comments about the persistent rain at an upcoming exhibition. At the MFA neutral territory that required no emotional investment from either of us. Only after we had both eaten enough to satisfy propriety did he set down his fork with deliberate precision. "I assume you've read your grandmother's letter and reviewed her files," he began, his tone carefully modulated. "Yes. And you have questions?" "Many." He nodded, as if this confirmed some private calculation. "I'll tell you everything I know, which may be less than you imagine. Contrary to what you might think, your mother and I never discussed the situation directly. But I wasn't blind, Mike. Elizabeth was 4 months pregnant when we reconciled after our separation. Basic mathematics made the possibility obvious. This frank acknowledgement surprised me. I had prepared for denial, for anger, for dismissal of my grandmother's claims as the delusions of an elderly woman. Instead, my father Richard was calmly confirming what should have been the most painful possible truth for him to admit. "You knew I wasn't biologically yours, and you never said anything," I asked, struggling to reconcile this with the man I thought I knew. "I made a choice," he replied, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since the will reading. "Elizabeth was my wife. I loved her despite our difficulties. When she returned, I chose to accept her pregnancy as our new beginning, without conditions or questions that would only cause pain. But after she died, I had a 3-year-old boy who had just lost his mother. Something flickered across his face, a brief crack in the composed facade. Whatever biological realities existed, you were legally and practically my son. My responsibility, I repeat. That's a telling word choice. He sighed, a sound that carried more weariness than I had ever heard him express. "I'm not good at this. The emotional aspects. Never have been. Your mother understood that about me. It was part of what drove her away initially, and after she was gone, double quotes, he trailed off, staring into his wineglass. I did what I knew how to do. I provided security, education, opportunities, the things a father is supposed to provide, but not connection. Not understanding? No," he agreed quietly, "not those things." We sat in silence for a moment, the admission hanging between us, not quite an apology, but perhaps the closest approximation his emotional vocabulary could produce. "My mother knew the truth," I said. "Your mother. Carolyn always knew everything," he replied, a hint of rueful recognition in his tone. "Elizabeth confided in her during the pregnancy. I discovered this only after your mother's death, when Caroline began taking a particularly active role in your upbringing. She never confronted me directly, but she made it clear through various comments that she was aware of the situation. And you were okay with that? With her knowing?" I was relieved. It meant someone else carried the knowledge, someone who could perhaps provide what I couldn't. "Caroline had a relationship with you that I never managed to create, despite being..." I told myself this was for the best. The frank assessment of his own limitations was surprisingly painful, affecting than the anger or defensiveness I had anticipated. This wasn't a man discovering shocking news about his son's paternity. This was a man who had lived with this knowledge for decades, making calculated decisions about how to manage it while maintaining the family's public narrative. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked, the question that had circled in my mind since reading my grandmother's letter. "At first, because you were too young. Then, because I didn't know how without destroying your image of your mother. Later." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Later, because I recognized that the truth might send you looking for Thomas Riley, and I wasn't prepared to potentially lose what little connection we had." The admission of vulnerability, however constrained, was so uncharacteristic of the Richard Harrison I knew that I found myself momentarily speechless. In the silence, he reached for an envelope on the sideboard behind him. "I have something for information your grandmother didn't." The envelope Richard handed me contained a single photograph worn at the edges, slightly faded but carefully preserved. It showed a younger version of my mother, laughing in autumn sunlight, her arm linked with a man I immediately recognized from my grandmother's research files. Thomas Riley appeared exactly as the newspaper clippings had shown him, tall and lanky with unruly dark hair and intense eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. They stood before a community garden, both wearing volunteer t-shirts for an environmental action. "Where did you get this?" I asked, unable to tear my gaze from the image of my mother looking so vibrantly happy beside the man who had contributed to my genetic makeup. "Elizabeth kept it in a book, a collection of Wendell-Berry essays. I found it after her death when I was sorting through her things." Richard's voice held no recrimination, just a distant sadness. "I should have destroyed it, I suppose. Family management experts would have advised us, but it seemed important, somehow. A piece of her I didn't know but should preserve." I studied the photograph, searching for traces of myself in Thomas Riley's features, the shape of his eyes perhaps, the set of his jaw. More striking were the parallels that couldn't be captured visually, his career in environmental journalism mirroring my own professional path, his evident activism aligned with causes I had gravitated toward since college. Nature or nurture became a more complex question when considering influences that operated through neither direct genetics nor present parenting. "Do you know anything about him? About their relationship?" I asked, finally looking up. Richard shook his head. "Elizabeth never spoke of him directly. I knew she had been involved with someone during our separation. She was honest about that much when we reconciled. But names, details, the nature of their connection, those remained unspoken between us. A mutually agreed silence, something like that." He refilled our wine glasses with methodical precision. "We were young, Michael. Barely 30. I was building my career, working 80-hour week, convinced that financial success would eventually translate to happiness. Elizabeth wanted connection, community, purpose beyond material achievement. We were pulling in different directions long before the separation. This frank assessment of their marital difficulties was unprecedented. Throughout my childhood, my mother had been referenced only in careful, sanctified terms, her memory preserved in sterile perfection rather than complicated humanity. After she came back, after you were born, we tried to find middle ground," Richard continued. "She became involved in the cultural organizations Caroline championed. I made efforts to be home for dinner more often. We were working towards something. And then the aneurysm took her, and all possibilities for resolution vanished. The sudden death of my mother when I was just 3 had shaped my childhood in ways I'd never fully articulated, creating a household of men ill-equipped to discuss emotions, building patterns of distance disguised as independence, establishing silence as our primary coping mechanism. I didn't know how to raise a child alone," Richard admitted, staring into his wine rather than meeting my eyes. "Especially not one who reminded me so much of Elizabeth. Your curiosity, your stubborn idealism, your refusal to accept convenient answers." I responded by becoming more rigid, more focused on providing structure and direction, the things I understood. While grandmother provided the emotional support, I finished for him. Yes, an arrangement that seemed functional at the time, though clearly created its own complications. He gestured vaguely, encompassing our current situation. I returned my attention to the photograph, to the laughing woman, and the man whose existence I'd learned of only weeks earlier. "I'm considering contacting him, Thomas." Richard nodded, his expression carefully. "I assumed you might. Caroline's files probably contain contact information." "They do. Current as of 2 months before her death." "Will you tell him about the inheritance?" The question carried multiple layers of implication about motivation, about identity, about the interplay of biology and opportunity. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I don't know what I'm going to tell him or what I want from the connection. I just know I need to make it." Richard sipped his wine, his financial analyst's mind visibly processing scenarios and contingencies. "The press will eventually make connections if you establish a relationship with. The Harrison inheritance changing hands is already newsworthy. Add a paternity revelation, and it becomes the kind of story people follow. I'm aware. The potential public dimensions hadn't escaped me. Boston's old money circles thrived on carefully maintained appearances and strategic information management. A biological revelation that disrupted the Harrison lineage would provide gossip material for years. "For what it's worth," Richard said after a thoughtful pause, "I don't object to you contacting it, whatever complications might arise. You deserve answers I can't provide." The statement represented perhaps the most significant acknowledgement of my autonomous personhood he had ever offered, recognition that my needs and choices existed independently of family reputation or his personal comfort. It was not quite warmth, not quite connection, but it was movement in a direction neither of us had previously explored. "Thank you," I said simply. "That ... matters." We finished dinner in a silence that felt different from our usual strained interactions, contemplative rather than defensive, weighted with unspoken thoughts but not hostile tension. As I prepared to leave, Richard handed me the photograph of my mother and Thomas. "You should have this," he said. "It's part of your history, not mine." I accepted it carefully, this tangible evidence of a connection I had never known existed and now couldn't ignore. "I'll let you know what I decide." "About contacting it?" Richard nodded, standing awkwardly in his foyer as if uncertain whether our new understanding warranted physical contact. We settled on a formal handshake that nonetheless lasted a moment longer than our usual perfunctory exchanges. Outside, Boston's spring evening had turned the earlier rain into a fine mist that softened streetlights into hazy. I walked several blocks before hailing a taxi, needing the physical movement to process the evening's revelation. Richard, the man I had always known as my father, had confirmed the truth of my biological origins while simultaneously complicating my understanding of his decades-long silence. Not denial, but acceptance. Not rejection, but inadequacy. Not anger, but resignation. The photograph rested in my inner jacket pocket, close to my heart in a symbolism too obvious to ignore. 3 decades of searching for connection had led me to this moment of choice, whether to reach across time and circumstance to contact a man who might fill gaps in my understanding of myself, or to accept the imperfect but familiar relationships that had shaped my life thus far. By the time the taxi reached my grandmother's, now my brownstone on Marlborough Street, I had made my decision. The Portland waterfront offered a picturesque setting for what might be the most consequential meeting of my life. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the harbor while seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries punctuating the ambient sounds of a working marina. I had chosen a public location, deliberately neutral territory where either of us could retreat if the conversation became too uncomfortable. I recognized Thomas Riley immediately as he approached the designated bench. Despite the physical changes that Parkinson's had imposed on the man from the photograph, he walked with a slight shuffle, his left hand occasionally exhibiting the characteristic tremor of the disease. But his posture remained upright and his gaze alert. At 64, he had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors, with lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and squinting into the sun. He spotted me with the awareness of a journalist trained to observe details, his steps faltering momentarily before he continued forward. I stood as he reached me, uncertain about proper protocol for greeting a biological father you've never met. "Michael Harrison," he said, extending his right hand, which remained steadier than his left. "You look even more like your mother in person than in the photos you sent. Thank you for agreeing to meet." Shaking his hand and noting the strength of his grip despite his condition. "I appreciate your openness to this unusual situation." We settled on the bench overlooking the harbor, an appropriate distance between us, close enough for conversation, but not so near as to force artificial intimacy. The email exchange that had led to this meeting had been brief and straightforward. My introduction, an explanation of my recently discovered biological connection, his surprised but welcoming response, a mutual agreement to meet without extended family present for this initial contact. "Your email mentioned Caroline Harrison passed recently," Thomas began. "I remember her from community meetings in Boston. Formidable woman." always impeccably dressed but asking the sharpest questions about environmental impact study. This characterization of my grandmother, recognizable but from an entirely different perspective than family anecdotes provided, offered a natural opening to the conversation. You encountered her professionally? Several times in the late 80s when I was investigating chemical dumping in the harbor. She represented a coalition of cultural organizations concerned about waterfront development. He smiled slightly. I had no idea then that she was connected to Elizabeth. Boston was a smaller world than I realized. She knew who you were, I said. She tracked your career over the years, kept files on your work. I discovered them after her death. Thomas absorbed this with the measured consideration of someone accustomed to processing unexpected information. That must have been quite a revelation, alongside everything else you learned. One of many, I acknowledged. Though finding out your biological father is an award-winning environmental journalist does explain some career inclinations I previously attributed to rebellion against family expectations. He laughed, a warm sound despite the hint of bitterness. Genetics are persistent, though I suspect Elizabeth's influence shaped you as well, even in her absence. The mention of my mother created a bridge between our separate experiences of his, as a brief but significant relationship, mine as a collection of early childhood memories and family stories. For the next hour, we exchanged perspectives and recollection, piecing together a more complete understanding of Elizabeth Harrison than either of us had possessed individually. She never told me she was pregnant, Thomas answering the question I had hesitated to ask directly. We were together for about 3 months during her separation. When she reconciled with her husband, she ended things cleanly, said she was committed to making her marriage work. I respected that, moved on professionally, if not entirely emotionally. He gazed out at the harbor, memory clearly pulling him backward. I often wondered what became of her. By the time I learned of her death through a mutual acquaintance, years had passed and it seemed inappropriate to reach out to the family. Would you have wanted to know about me? The question emerged more vulnerably than I had intended. Thomas turned to face me directly, his expression solemn. Without hesitation, yes. I would have wanted to know I had a son, regardless of the complicated circumstance, but I understand why Elizabeth made the choices she did. Returning to an established marriage offered stability and social acceptance that our relationship, new and unconventional by her family's standards, couldn't provide. The answer contained no recrimination toward my mother, no bitterness about opportunities denied, only a mature recognition of complex human choices made within the constraints of their time and circumstance. This grace in his response, this capacity to acknowledge loss without assigning blame, resonated deeply with values I had cultivated in my own approach to journalism and life. As our conversation progressed to his current circumstances, his ongoing environmental writing despite physical limitations, his volunteer work with youth literacy programs, his solitary but purpose-driven life in Portland, I found myself identifying points of connection that transcended both genetics and our brief acquaintance. We shared not just physical features and professional interests, but approaches to ethical questions, perspectives on social responsibility, even similar dry humor that emerged as our initial awkwardness receded. I should tell you, I said as our conversation reached a natural pause, there are financial implications to this connection that I haven't mentioned yet. Thomas raised an eyebrow, his journalist's instinct for significant information evidently intact. Financial implications? I explained my grandmother's bequest, the brownstone, the investments, the substantial resources now at my disposal. I wanted to meet you without that information coloring our interaction, to establish whether a relationship was possible based on who we are, not what either of us might gain or lose materially. He nodded slowly, processing this revelation with the same measured consideration he had shown throughout our meeting. I appreciate that approach. Money complicates human connections in ways nothing else quite manages. The inheritance is mine regardless of what happens between us, I clarified. I'm not suggesting any financial obligation or opportunity. I just wanted transparency moving forward. Transparency is always preferable, though I admit some curiosity about Caroline Harrison's motivations, directing her estate away from her son to a grandson she knew wasn't biologically related to her. Seems pointed. The observation cut to the heart of questions I had been grappling with since the will reading. I think she was making a statement about values rather than biology, about choices and priorities that aligned more with her evolving perspective than with traditional family expectations, and perhaps offering you freedom she didn't feel she could provide during her lifetime, Thomas. The financial independence to determine your own relationship with both your fathers, without economic pressures influencing those choices. The insight from someone who had just entered my life, yet seemed to intuitively understand dimensions of my situation I was still articulating to myself, created a moment of connection more profound than our shared physical features or professional interests had established. In that moment, I recognized that whatever relationship might develop between us would be built on mutual understanding, rather than mere biological fact or social obligation. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, we discussed next steps with the careful consideration of two people recognizing a significant junction in their lives. No dramatic declarations of instant family bonds, no promises that might prove unsustainable, but a mutual acknowledgement that our connection warranted further exploration with appropriate boundaries and expectations. "I'd like to visit Boston sometime," Thomas said as we prepared to part. "See your work, perhaps meet Richard if that becomes appropriate. Build this relationship step by step, whatever form it ultimately takes." The measured approach, prioritizing substance over appearance and authenticity over convention, echoed my grandmother's final assessment of values that mattered more than social conformity or financial achievement. Perhaps she had recognized in Thomas Riley, even from a distance, qualities she had come to prioritize in her own evolution from Boston society matriarch to more nuanced ethical thinker. As we shook hands in farewell, the harbor breeze carrying the scent of salt and possibilities, I found myself grateful not just for new connections, but for the complex interplay of choices, my mother's, Richard's, my grandmother's, and now my own, that had created this moment of potential transformation. The inheritance that mattered most, it seemed, was not the material wealth that had changed hands, but the freedom to pursue authentic relationships, unbounded by conventional expectations or financial necessity. That evening, from my hotel room overlooking Portland's quieting streets, I sent Richard a brief message. "Met Thomas today. Complicated but positive. Would like to talk when I return." His response came more quickly than I expected. "My door is open whenever you're ready." A small step, but in a new direction, one that acknowledged the truth while creating space for relationship rather than merely shared history. Perhaps that was what my grandmother had intended all along when she had instructed her attorney to point directly at me, transferring not just assets but the opportunity to reshape connection that decades of silence had left atrophied, but not beyond revival. 1 year after the will reading that had transformed my understanding of family and identity, I stood in the garden behind my grandmother's, now definitively Mybrown stone, surveying the gathering that represented my reconfigured life. The spring evening was perfect for the outdoor reception, with string lights illuminating the brick patio and carefully tended flower beds that Mrs. Sullivan maintained, with the same exacting standards my grandmother had established. The occasion was ostensibly a housewarming, though I had been living in the brownstone for months. In reality, it was something more significant, a public acknowledgement of connections that had previously existed only in private conversations and carefully managed interaction. Richard arrived precisely on time, characteristic punctuality undiminished by the past year's revelations and adjustments. He navigated the gathering with the practiced social ease of someone accustomed to professional networking. Though I noted subtle differences in his engagement, more genuine attention to conversations, less performance of expected pleasantries, our relationship remained complicated but had evolved towards something more authentic than the stilted formality that had previously defined it. "The renovations turned out well," he commented, gesturing toward the updated kitchen that now opened onto the garden. A modification that would have been unthinkable during my grandmother's lifetime. Caroline would have objected to the open concept, but I think she would have appreciated the purpose behind it, creating space for actual gatherings rather than formal entertaining, I suggested. "Exactly." A small smile acknowledged our shared understanding of my grandmother's evolution from social enforcer to more nuanced family matriarch. "Thomas is coming? He should be here shortly." His train from Portland was delayed. Richard nodded, his composure betraying only the slightest tension. This would be their third meeting, each progressively less awkward than the last, though still navigating uncharted territory in family dynamics. No etiquette guide covered appropriate interactions between a man and his ex-wife's former lover, who happened to be his presumed son's biological father. "I'll be fine," Richard added, correctly interpreting my concerned glance. We've established a reasonable rapport, and Julia will be here to smooth any rough edges. Julia Chun, his colleague from the Boston Symphony Orchestra Board, had become a significant presence in Richard's life over the past 6 months. First, as a friend who shared his appreciation for classical music, gradually evolving into a relationship that seemed to engage dimensions of his personality that had previously remained dormant or suppressed. Her influence had coincided with subtle but meaningful shifts in his approach to both work and family connection. Thomas arrived 30 minutes later, moving more deliberately than when we had first met, but maintaining the alert engagement that characterized his approach to life despite his progressing Parkinson. He had visited Boston several times over the past year, our relationship developing through conversations that spanned his journalistic career, my mother's brief but significant role in his life, and the environmental advocacy work that connected our professional interests across generations. "Sorry I'm late," he said, accepting the sparkling water I offered in lieu of wine, a choice that accommodated his medication requirements. Train issues. Then the cab driver took the scenic route when he heard I was from out of town. "You're just in time for the unofficial announcement," I assured him, guiding him toward the small gathering of people who represented my reconstructed understanding of family and connection. Besides Richard and Julia, the group included colleagues from my environmental journalism work, friends who had supported me through the past year's revelations, and most significantly, Alina Vasquez, the anthropologist who had provided my grandmother with ethical perspective during the early days of my mother's pregnancy, and who had subsequently maintained a discreet friendship with Caroline Harrison until her death. "I've invited you all here because you represent the most important connections in my life," I began once everyone had assembled. "Some are long-standing relationships that have evolved in unexpected ways. Others are newer connections that have filled gaps in my understanding of both family history and personal identity." I paused, glancing between Richard and Thomas, the two fathers who represented different dimensions of paternity and relationship. Neither looked away, a significant evolution from the averted gazes that had characterized our earlier interactions. "What I've learned this past year is that family extends beyond biology and legal definition. It's created through choices, maintained through honest communication, and strengthened through mutual respect for individual paths." With deliberate significance, I raised my glass. "Today, I'm announcing the establishment of the Elizabeth Harrison Foundation for Environmental Journalism, created with a portion of my grandmother's bequest. The foundation will support investigative reporting on environmental justice, with particular emphasis on collaborative approaches that bridge scientific research and community advocacy." The announcement represented months of planning and consultation, transforming financial inheritance into purposeful action that honored multiple legacies: my mother's community engagement, Thomas's journalistic principles, my grandmother's ethical evolution, and even Richard's growing recognition that achievement could be measured in social impact rather than merely financial metrics. As congratulations and conversations flowed around me, I observed the unexpected tableau of my two fathers engaged in what appeared to be genuine conversation rather than merely polite acknowledgement. Their relationship would never be uncomplicated, but its evolution from avoidance to cautious respect mirrored my own journey from inherited silence to chosen transparency. My grandmother's final orchestration, the attorney pointing directly at me while my father avoided my eyes, had initiated more than a transfer of material assets. It had created the conditions for reconstructing relationships based on truth rather than convenient narratives, substance rather than appearance, authentic connection rather than social expectation. The true inheritance, it seemed, was not the brownstone or the investments, but the freedom to forge connections unbounded by conventional definitions of family or success, a legacy that would continue to unfold in ways my grandmother might have anticipated, but had wisely left for me to discover through my own experience rather than predetermined instruction. As evening deepened and conversations continued under the garden lights, I recognized that while questions of nature versus nurture remained philosophically complex, the practical reality was simpler. We are shaped by both genetic inheritance and chosen relationships, by circumstances beyond our control and decisions within our power, by the secrets kept in previous generations and the truths we choose to acknowledge in our own. That complex interplay of influences and choices, not merely financial resources or biological connections, constituted the most significant inheritance of all.